that was kind of fun, learning about gestures and animations and whatnot. What we're going to cover now is something that you kind of need to know about, but is not nearly as fun or exciting, but it's sort of like just something you have to do when you're making forms. And that's, you have to avoid the keyboard from covering up content that is relevant, which is super boring, but unfortunately necessary. So as you can see, I added this other field down here for conference badge number, and when I tap on it and the keyboard opens, I can't see it anymore. And so there are various ways to handle this. There's something built into React Native called keyboard avoiding view. I think there's like a really easy to remember trick for keyboard avoiding view. You should avoid keyboard avoiding view because I've never found any good use for it. So I tried to make this example work with it and could not find any way to make it work well with it. So yeah, the name is kind of, let's just delete that. I mean, if you go ahead and check it out, play with it if you find it useful, and do that. I don't find it particularly useful, so you might notice earlier I added a link to some helper component under the day 2 thing called keyboard event listener. So this is just a bit of an abstraction over some built-in APIs in React Native that are a little bit lower level than the keyboard avoiding view. In fact, it's what keyboard avoiding view builds on top of. And so let's just take a look at kind of what I'm doing here. So keyboard event listener, what it does is first we import this thing called keyboard from React Native. Easy enough. So keyboard is an event emitter, so we add a listener to it, and unfortunately the names are slightly different for the events that we're interested in on iOS and Android. So there's this conditional: if we are on iOS, then we listen for keyboard will change frame. If we're on Android, then keyboard did show and keyboard did hide. And so this keyboard event listener is useful because you don't have to have that conditional then everywhere where you want to deal with the keyboard. And then you don't have to manage cleaning up after all those 3 subscriptions. And further, you don't have to deal with differences between the platforms at this level. And I won't concern you too much with what's happening here, but ultimately what it does is when the event fires, it gives you the start coordinates and the end coordinates for the keyboard. So it starts at the bottom, it ends at whatever point where sort of like the height of the keyboard, essentially. So it could be 200 or something like that. It gives you the duration and the easing. So if it's at 0 and it's going to end at 200, it might take 700 milliseconds maybe, and with a specific easing curve. And so that allows you to animate whatever change you need to do to your layout in order to make it kind of a smoother transition to adjusting the layout accordingly. So, all right, we have this thing, that's good. All we have to do for it is call subscribe, and then when things change, we will get a callback that will be an object that has the keyboard height and the layout animation config. So I've already imported that here. I'm going to go into component, well, mount, keyboard. Let's just look at keyboard height first, and console log keyboard. I can't really look at those logs. I'm actually going to reopen this. Actually, yeah, you can kind of read that maybe. I should reopen it though. Okay, so keyboard opened, keyboard height 216, right? So we're getting that callback. That's working as expected. Let's just move this onto the same screen so you can see it happen. You can see when the keyboard went away, the keyboard height was 0. Now, when I trigger the keyboard on again, it comes up as 216. So obviously, this is covering our content still, so now we have to think like, okay, how are we going to handle this? So a common thing to do is, I mean, you need to scroll your scroll view to get to the point where you can actually see the content, right? So let's do that. I'm going to warn you in advance, this isn't entirely going to solve our problem, but let's try it. Let's say keyboard height, whatever, and we'll just say this dot scroll view dot scroll to y. Actually, do I even have the content size here? I did that. So there's a callback there, so we know the size of the content in the scroll view. So let's scroll to the this dot content size. So scroll to the end. Another thing you can do, I believe, is scroll view, scroll to end, but let's not use that for now. Oh, this is not ideal. Let's change it to use localhost and reopen that. It's a little tip. If you're using XDE, if you have no reason to use the tunnel, then don't bother. Just switch it to use host of localhost, and it loads so much quicker because it doesn't have to, do the whole round trip. So, okay. Click on that thing. Ugh, that's not really what we wanted, is it? That's not what we wanted at all. So, I mean, kind of does the thing, but it's not really right. It is visible, so that's good. So we have a couple of tools now. We know how we could scroll somewhere, and we know how to determine the keyboard height, and we know how to determine the size of the content. So another thing we know in this particular case is that the only thing that can be obscured is, I mean, realistically, these aren't going to be obscured on any screen of any size, is going to be this badge number field. So we have this onFocus event, handle focus badge field. We can do something with that. And let's also set the state so we know the keyboard height. So we're tracking the keyboard height in the state, and we get a callback when this is focused. And so let's go up here, get rid of that, clear this. So when I click on that, we see that the focus event fires before we get the keyboard height. So we don't know how much we can scroll at that point because the keyboard hasn't adjusted, right? So we can't assume any given keyboard height at that time. But what we can do, at least, is set some property maybe to say that we should scroll. So like, pretty stateful, pretty unpleasant. Definitely good to build abstractions around this kind of thing. And so then when we set the keyboard height, right, we can actually, at this point, scroll view, and let's do that first. Okay, so if we just scroll to the end, in that case, it's still obscured, right? So one way to get around that is, this is pretty often a strategy that most people use, is to add like a view that's sort of a spacer for the keyboard. So you can say style equals height, this does state the keyboard. And again, I wouldn't recommend doing manual stuff like this in all of your forms. You want to build your own kind of abstraction. What's going on there? Should definitely do that here. And I'm doing something wrong still. And keyboard height. And let's do it in a request animation frame. Kind of works. Has the bit too much space probably at the bottom, but at least it's within the view. And we can customize exactly where we want to scroll rather than using scroll to end by taking into account the content size. So scroll to end might not be ideal. So we say scroll view, scroll to Y, that content size. Could say keyboard height. Oh, that was not expected. My bad. Dimensions. And that's the opposite of the direction I want to go. I don't know what I'm doing with this thing. Content size, what does that give us? Oops. As you can see, it's not very pleasant dealing with keyboard-related things. And I don't know, let's just do minus. Oh, did I add the keyboard height before? Maybe that was the problem. Yeah. Oops. So yeah, that is pretty much what you can do to make sure you scroll thing into view. And then when you go back like this, you unfocus it, it'll just pop back. Yeah. So this is one approach within a scroll view. Often you thankfully don't have to do something that's like quite as complicated. With longer forms, you'll probably have some kind of abstraction that you build on top of this that just like measures the position of the text input that you focus and then scroll to that text input to maybe center it on the screen or something like that. Often what you're dealing with is something where you have like a sign-in screen where you might have like two inputs and then you need to adjust the positioning in order to just keep those two inputs on the screen. So there's less to think about because you don't have to actually scroll the content. You just have to add a spacer to the screen. So an example could be if we go to snack. Actually, it's probably easier to not use snack for that because we can't use our keyboard avoiding view as easily. So let's create authentication screen and an app. So we have this view that takes up the whole screen. Give it background color, something. And align the items. Justify content. Line 4, I've got a typo. I forgot to write class. And just add some text. All right. Height 50. Okay. And you can add another one here for password. You might remember we have to use secure text entry for that. Very pretty, right? So this is secure text entry. So maybe we have some big logo there, so it's quite possible for us to not see the inputs. This is images, React Europe. So let's drop an image in there. Not the correct URL.
HTTPS.
Yeah, it just says not found. Oh, it requires www in front. Cool. All right. So really ugly sign-in screen, but that is pretty annoying. So let's resolve this. You could actually use keyboard avoiding view in this context, but let's use the same thing. Import keyboard event listener. So we have the keyboard height, and probably the easiest thing we could do here is just say margin top negative this dot state dot keyboard height, right? Yeah. So get it if we do that, but this doesn't really look that good if you do that. So this is why you get the second parameter, which, what's the name of that again? LayoutAnimation config. And now we can import LayoutAnimation. And let's see if I can remember the API. Configure next, LayoutAnimation config. Right, and now it like animates using the same curve as the keyboard, which is kind of nice. So there is no like out-of-the-box sort of thing that handles everything for you with keyboards right now. You know, there's some cases in scroll views where you have to do stuff like what I was just showing you. Like I said, I've made other abstractions on top of that that work in specific contexts where I wanted to center everything that was focused. But it's kind of like right now you just kind of have to understand how to monitor the keyboard and how you might want to modify your views and scroll or whatever you might need to do in order to make sure that everything's kept in a good spot. Yeah, it's funny that text moves like that. Yeah. All right, so any questions about keyboard? So I don't really want to go into too much detail about layout animation. It's described in the docs, but it basically uses like the, on iOS, the built-in animation API for when you say one property is this and then the other property is this and automatically animate between these two properties. And then that's kind of re-implemented on Android. And configure next essentially takes configuration that allows you to say like, should this be a spring animation? How long should it last? What kind of easing do you want for it? And then it will take all of the values, the layout values that have changed from from this certain transaction. So that's like everything that's committed over the bridge during that frame, and it'll animate them from that thing to the next thing. So you kind of have to use it like a little bit carefully because you don't always want to apply that to everything. The main use case, I would say, there are two main use cases are like drag and drop in a list. So it's good to use layout animation when you're dragging to like, when you rearrange the indexes for items to kind of like automatically move and transition from one to the other. And then it's also useful here for the keyboard to like shift the whole layout in response to this happening. It's useful for when like a lot of things need to move in order to update like their position on the screen. So as you can see, automatically animates views into their new positions when the next layout happens. So definitely worth knowing about, but most people probably just use it for the keyboard context. So I can paste this thing in here for you.